Welcome to Lyric Lab Poetry. In this video, we're going to explore a new form of poetry. I'm going to give you a poetry exercise that's going to help you explore that new form, and then you're going to write a poem in that new form. A new form of poetry. It's not often that we get a chance to say that. If you think about the sonnet, for example, a form that has been with us for, I don't know, around 800 years or so, and that has been reinvented many times. One of the things that modernism and postmodernism does to poetry is to have a kind of conversation with received forms and to reinvent them. But I don't think before now, I can't think of a time in contemporary poetry when a new form has emerged so fully formed and has concreted itself so firmly into the consciousness of contemporary poetics. The name of this form is very odd. It's called the Golden Shovel, and it was invented by a highly regarded American poet called Terrance Hayes. I have some of his books on the shelf right here. He's known for creating poetry of lyrical beauty, for experimenting with received forms. A case in point, on the shelf just over there is his collection, American Sonnets for My Past and Future Assassin. He also writes across themes, which also include, I should mention, because it's relevant to the Golden Shovel, things like identity and masculinity and also race. So before we get to the Golden Shovel, let me just mention another poet and explain that last week I was facilitating a public poetry workshop, and we had a brief conversation about art in public spaces, specifically poetry in public spaces. And I had mentioned in that conversation a project in London known as a poem on the underground. If you go onto the London Metro system, you sit down on one of the seats, you look up, you'll see these boards. They are advertising boards. They're about, I guess, 2 feet by 1 foot, and they're usually used for advertising. Sometimes they contain important information about your journey, and then occasionally you'll come across a poem on the underground. Now, because the font size has to be of a certain size in order for you to comfortably read it from your seat, it means that in this kind of small space you can't really cram a very long poem. So brevity is key, and you're not going to find Homer's The Odyssey up there printed in full. Even though sometimes journeying by public transport can feel like a Homeric Odyssey. Okay. So when I got home from that workshop, I remembered that actually somewhere on my shelf, this book was lurking, and it is called Poetry in Motion from Coast to Coast. There are over 100 poems in here, short poems. This was part of a project in the 1990s that originated in New York and then traveled to other American cities such as Baltimore, Chicago, and Los Angeles. And all of the poems are really short poems that would fit in one of those small spaces that you might see above your head during your journey on public transport. And as I was flicking through the book, I'd forgotten that there's a poem in here, very famous poem by Gwendolyn Brooks, and I'd forgotten that it was in this book. I should have known because it's one of her most, if not her most widely anthologized poem. It's called We Real Cool, and you can see here, just by looking there, that it's very, very contained on the page. There are only 24 words to the poem. Just below the title of the poem, there's kind of like an epigraph or a kind of subtitle. It says, "The Pool Players, 7 at the Golden Shovel." And the poem starts, "We real cool, we left school, we lurk late, we strike straight, we." The poem continues, the end of every line has that we, and this creates a kind of rhythmic element to the poem, a kind of musicality, but also, for me at least, it reinforces this idea of the speaker and this collective experience. I think what the poem sums up very well. I tell you what, actually, before we go any further, just pause the video and go down into the description below the video where you'll find a link to the poem in its entirety, all 24 words. Go and read that and then come back. Okay, you've read the poem, you're back, and we're on the same page, because you have read, or you can see the poem before you now as I can see it. And I think what she does so brilliantly is to capture or distill, which is one of the things poetry does so well, isn't it? It really is a heightened distillation of language. She captures this marginalized experience through the lens of Black American experience. She grew up in Chicago. It's clear to me, although it's not explicitly stated, that what we're talking about are 7 young men, 7 boys, who are skipping school to shoot pool. And as she walks past, and it's almost as if the speaker walks past this pool hall and looks in, and just this moment where she sees these men, there's a kind of surety, there's a kind of performative coolness, until we get to the last part of the poem. It ends, the last 2 lines, or the last word of the penultimate line is "we," and then the last 2 words and the last line of the poem, "die soon." That takes my breath away, because dying soon is something that happens too often to young Black men in America. We are now in an age post George Floyd, and we are in a moment that is challenging the fact that the lived experience continues to be different depending on the pigmentation of your skin. In another way, it speaks to me about that distilled moment, that captured, frozen moment of young men, of being young and carefree, and that being something that the poet celebrates. And it's ephemeral, isn't it? It is something that is mercurial and is there, transient, as are all stages of life. But I think it also speaks to that experience through the African American lens. And so to that extent, it is still a very contemporary American poem. What she does so brilliantly here in 24 words is to capture the spirit of a marginalized youth. And it's a very eloquent and cool poem. So now let's turn our attention to this wonderful collection, Lighthead by Terrance Hayes. And in it, a few pages in, you'll find a poem called The Golden Shovel, after Gwendolyn Brooks, it says. And the poem's much longer than her 24-word poem. It's actually in 2 parts, 2 sections. The first section is numbered or dated 1981, and the second part 1991. So kind of 2 narratives 10 years apart that speak to the young male experience. The first line captures brilliantly with an image of a child wearing his father's sock halfway up his arm. When I was so small that my arm could fit inside my father's sock. What a brilliant way of explaining or speaking to or showing the reader the speaker as a young boy traveling alongside his father. This also is a poem about human experience through the African American lens, 10 years apart, those 2 sections. The Golden Shovel. What the Golden Shovel does is it takes every word from the Gwendolyn Brooks poem, We Real Cool, and each successive word becomes the last word in each line of his poem. So actually, there would therefore need to be 24 lines. In fact, because the poem is in 2 parts, there are 48 lines. There are 12 couplets in each section. And if you look down the right-hand side of his poem, you can literally read Gwendolyn Brooks' poem, We Real Cool, we left school, we lurk late, we strike straight, and on. So Gwendolyn Brooks' poem is contained within. It's brilliant that poets have this kind of dialogue. I recently read a poem by Kamika Han, and that poem uses a famous line from a poem by Wilfred Owen, a famous World War I poet, and it uses this technique of anaphora, which is to repeat a certain phrase or a few words at the beginning of each line. This conversation continues between poets, and it's a dialogue in this sense between the writer of this poem, Terrance Hayes, and the writer of We Real Cool, Gwendolyn Brooks, I think about how that danger implicit in the last two words of her poem, Dying Soon, are spoken to in Terrance Hayes' poem, The Golden Shovel. It's a brilliant poem. Both poems are brilliant. And what a brilliant example he's given us of a new form. So the form works by including a line from, or in this case, an entire poem by another poet. And so just to return to that idea of brevity, if you can find a poem that's very short, maybe an imagist poem by Ezra Pound or William Carlos Williams. I'm thinking actually, because I mentioned the metro station, in a station of the metro by Ezra Pound has about 14 words in it. That would be a great one to use as a model for your poem, A Golden Shovel. So the thing, your prompt is to go and find an anthology of poems, short poems, the shorter the better, and find a poem that speaks to you. And then you're then going to write a Golden Shovel poem, which is a new poem that kind of is a dialogue between you and the other poet and the other poet's poem, creating something new. And remember that each of the last words of each line will be one successive word from the original poem that you're drawing on to create your Golden Shovel. It's a real challenge in terms of form, I think. And it also references the video I've just made. The last video that I posted was about lineation. So hold that in mind. Lineation is being determined for you by each successive word of the poem that you're using to base your Golden Shovel poem on. It's a really interesting experiment and exercise, but hopefully will also lead you to your own Golden Shovel poem. There is actually also an entire anthology of golden shovels, and I'm going to put a link to that, by brilliant poets, each of whom are using the work of Gwendolyn Brooks. What a great thing Terrance Hayes has done there to create this dialogue between his poem and her poem, but then also to get the ball rolling on successive Golden Shovel poems that use her material, that draw us back to her as a poet and her brilliance. She shone very brightly, but she is known mainly, I suppose, in common culture for that one poem, We Real Cool. There's so much more to her work. So why not use one of her poems as inspiration? And if it's a very long poem, maybe just use the first line of one of her poems. And I will put links in the description below to that Golden Shovel anthology that I just mentioned. So check it out. Go and find a poem that's short, that speaks to you, and write your very own Golden Shovel poem based on that. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please do click the like button and the subscribe button. Of course, I'll be back soon with more poetry, and thank you so much for being here.